Welcome everybody for joining us. We're very excited to be able to have this virtual town hall program. I think it'll be very interesting and I look forward to the discussion. I'm State Senator Rachel Zenzinger. I represent Senate District 19, which is Arvada and Westminster, all in Jefferson County. And I am up for re-election this year and very much looking forward to the next 27 days going by very quickly. So I want to pass it off to the rest of my colleagues in order to introduce themselves as well, so that we can get right to the program. And I will call on Representative Tracy Kraft-Tharp.
There, I'm Tracy Kraft-Tharp. I'm the state representative in House District 29, which is North and East Arvada, the Jefferson County part of Westminster. And I have appreciated working with you all this last 8 years, and this is a good way to be winding up my legislative career because I'm termed out. I'm done in January, but am running for Jeffco County Commissioner. So thank you very much for coming to the district and meeting with our folks and providing this great information. I see some of our amazing House District 29 and Westminster folks are joining us. So thank you. Hi, Rich. Hi, Klaus.
I'm State Representative Shannon Bird, and I represent House District 35, which is the Adams County portion of Westminster, and then also some adjacent unincorporated Adams County. I'm thrilled to be here today and so very interested in what you have to say and to learn about how our buildings are actually emitting carbon emissions, greenhouse gases. Looking forward to finding ways we can be part of the solution. And to Lindsay.
Sorry. Hi, everyone. Lindsay Doherty, candidate for Representative Kraft-Tharp's seat at HD 29. So it's great to be here. I'm happy to learn and I'm looking forward to the presentation. Thank you.
Before we move on, I think Barbara McLaughlin has joined us. So maybe she could say hello.
This is true.
Hi, welcome from Durango.
Yeah, I'm going to be in the car, so I thought, oh, I can listen to this while I'm driving everywhere. So I will be listening attentively because I'm really interested in this. So thank you.
So Barbara, Jerry Johnson here.
Hi, Jerry.
If you have an interest in replicating this in your part of the state, we would love to help with that.
I would love to do that, Jerry. What a great idea. Yes, yes, yes to me. So yeah, I will get back in touch with you when this is over. Great, thank you.
So with that, we have a couple of different guests that are going to be presenting today, and I'm not sure who's going to be kicking off the order, but we're just going to kind of review. They're going to go into a little bit about their background, and then they're going to just jump right in and talk to us a little bit about how our carbon neutral buildings have become achievable, some of the advancements in carbon measurement that's transforming design and construction, and they'll be going into some more details about what's happening locally. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to whomever is going to be starting the program today. One of our three guests, either Paul Hutton, Kevin Aronimus, or Brandon Gossard.
And I think that's me who's going to start. Nick, would you like me to go ahead and start the sharing screen and getting it started?
Go ahead, Paul.
Okay, I will do so. So I should be sharing screen right now. Hopefully you're seeing a screen that has a lot of green on it. Yes? Everybody seeing that? Good. Okay, thank you. So the three of us today who are presenting on behalf of the American Institute of Architects, myself, Paul Hutton, my other colleagues are Kevin Aronimus and Brandon Gossard. You can see our contact information and the names of our firms there on the left-hand side. We are all practicing architects here in the Metro Denver area. And I'll spare you any details about our firms or the kind of things that we work on. I just want to say we're all passionate about this concept of decarbonizing the built environment, and that's what we're excited to talk to you about today. So if you want to know more about our individual backgrounds, you can reach out to us or ask us specifics, but let's just go ahead and get into the content because that's the reason we're really here. So as you know, we're representing the AIA. The AIA has more than 2,000 members who are active here in Colorado, and as such, we serve the public. And part of serving the public is our new, not new, but a relatively recently reinforced commitment to dealing with climate change. In fact, our organization declared an imperative around climate change just last year. And to demonstrate the degree to which we take this seriously, the code of ethics by which all architects are governed and guides our behavior on a daily basis has been substantially reformed to reflect a renewed awareness around the issues of climate change and environment. And these are just some of the key changes to our code of ethics. So to us, that was a very significant moment in our professional obligations and practices. All of you know about building codes. Of course, we've been dealing with building codes for a very long time. I think it's interesting, though, to understand that building codes didn't even begin to address the issue of energy efficiency and therefore greenhouse gas emissions until the middle 1970s, not that long ago in reality. Encouraging right now on the building code front is the degree to which we have a situation where states and local municipalities are actually advancing their adoption of more advanced and rigorous building codes. So even though at the national policy level, the impression is that we've gone backwards, in reality, most of the buildings that we're designing right here in Colorado are on ever more stringent criteria. And that's something we're very thankful for. Here you see a little headline about Denver having adopted a new, more aggressive building code, and Denver's not alone. Across the state of Colorado, we have municipalities doing these kind of things. So that's really exciting. In fact, here's just a quick chart that shows how Denver, as an example of other municipalities, is using the building code to drive improvement in carbon reductions. So this green dashed line is the important line on this chart. What it shows is that following Denver's building codes will result in the building sector having zero emissions by the year 2035. That's actually pretty ambitious. There are people who would like to see it happen even faster than that. But the reality is that for us architects and building designers, getting to zero by 2035 is a pretty aggressive challenge. And we're excited to embracing that. In addition to the AIA, you've probably heard of many other organizations who are involved in the sector of building decarbonization. The U.S. Green Building Council and their LEED program is one of those that is especially well known. So as architects, we're happy to deal with these, and we embrace a lot of these other even more stringent standards that are out there. In fact, we'll be showing you a few buildings that deal with those. I wanted to share with you just one example of a project that's underway in our office right now. This is a best funded project down in the San Luis Valley at the Sierra Grande School District. And the reason I wanted to share it with you is our first large building. This is 90,000 square feet that is 100% electric. There's no natural gas in this building, not in the science labs, not even in the cooking kitchen. So we wanted to show you that it is very possible to go ahead with electrification of not just residential buildings, but large institutional buildings as well. There's one other organization that I wanted to tell you about today, and it's what we call Architecture 2030. And this is an organization parallel to the AIA that has adopted a standard of every half decade lowering carbon emissions of new buildings by another 10%. We've been working with this program now for 15 years. So we've already gotten today to the goal of reducing carbon emissions from our new buildings by 80%, which is a pretty aggressive target. In 2025, we need to move that to 90%. And as you can see from this graphic, by the time we get to the year 2030, that's our target year as a profession for when we hope to be carbon neutral with all of our new buildings. And many of us member firms in the AIA actually rigorously track and report the results of all of our buildings relative to the standard. So I was just going to highlight this little block chart here on the far left of your screen. That 49.9%, it represents our total building portfolio last year in 2019. And so you can see we had made pretty good progress. The goal last year was 70%, so we were just a nose under 50%. So every year we track and record this data and measure our progress, as do hundreds of other member AIA firms. And of course, if you don't measure something, how are you going to make progress? In addition, though, to measuring what happens with the design of our buildings, at Cuningham Group, we're very serious about walking the talk with our own operations. So we rigorously track in all of our 6 US offices and 2 overseas offices the carbon emissions and basically calculate our own corporate carbon footprint. And this is a graphic that illustrates that footprint for you. The big takeaway is that right now, per employee per year, we're right around 5.7 tons of total greenhouse gas emissions. And now that we know this, we have put in place a plan to offset 100% of those emissions by the year 2022. And we're finding that more and more of our clients are very interested in knowing what we're doing about our carbon footprint. So if we were live today and gathered together in person, I would ask you this as a quiz. I'd like you to tell me which of these 3 sectors in our economy, transportation, buildings, or industry, do you think is most responsible for greenhouse gas emissions? Which would it be? Since we're not live, I can't quite do the quiz, but usually I get people thinking either transportation or industry. And the answer is right here. The transportation and building operations are very close to one another. They're just about neck and neck, right around a quarter of that total pie. Industry is the single biggest chunk at nearly half. But there's one more piece of this that we need to understand and dig a little bit deeper. What we find when we take apart that big section of industry is that a very significant portion of it is actually all the materials that go into our buildings. So when we add all the greenhouse gas emissions from operating our buildings to the greenhouse gas emissions that are due to all the materials that we generate to create the built environment, we find that the combination of those is a full 39% of total global as well as US greenhouse gas emissions. So the big takeaway here is that buildings do make a very big difference. How we design and construct them is a very important piece of solving the carbon problem. So when we think about the built environment, everything that we construct in this world, there are 3 main sources of carbon emissions that we think about as architects. The one on that top right is new building operations. And the good news is we're getting better and better every year with making those new buildings more efficient. And as you saw from that chart with the building code, we're on track to get to 0 new building operations within not much more than a decade. Existing building operations, though, remain a very significant problem because we have such an enormous building stock already in place. And we need to put in place better measures to start to tackle the problem of how do we more rapidly decarbonize the emissions coming from our large stock of existing buildings. And now on that top left, materials, construction, infrastructure, that's the emerging frontier for us in terms of decarbonizing the built environment. Because as we saw, a tremendous amount of carbon emissions relate to concrete, to steel, to glass, to all the materials that we generate. And we're only scratching the surface now in understanding how to make a dent in that. But if we think about that issue of those materials, there are some specific things that we can start to do better as a profession and as an economy and a society. The 3 big keys, and the first of those is simply to reuse, to use our resources more effectively. So where we have existing buildings, let's try and find ways to adaptively reuse them and find ways for them to continue into use longer into the future instead of simply demolishing things. We can also find ways to be more creative in how we utilize our urban areas and revitalize them. And finally, when it is time to take apart a building, instead of all that material going to landfill, let's try to use more of it again and repurpose it in future buildings. The next piece is to reduce. As we're starting to design buildings now, we work with our structural engineers, for example. In fact, we have a structural engineer on this call, I noticed, Bob Redwine, welcome. So we're talking a lot right now about structure optimization. If we're enclosing a certain amount of square feet, how do we do that with less steel, with less concrete? Other things that we want to talk about are how do we specify materials that actually use less carbon to make them? And that's a very big push for many municipalities right now. And finally, how can we design buildings and environments that sequester carbon, that actively remove carbon from the environment? So Using more wood is one key answer to that. You'll see some projects that do that in just a little bit. We're also challenging our landscape designers to show us ways to design sites that start to sequester more carbon than they release. And in fact, we have established targets, just as we had targets that you saw for reducing operational carbon in buildings. We now have targets. Right now, we're saying we think we can reduce the embodied carbon going into all these materials by 40%. And by the year 2040, that's our goal for when we will have zero emissions in the materials sector. I just wanted to share with you our excitement about a bill that came before the Senate just this year, and we believe it will come back again next year. And that was a bill that proposed that all state-funded projects in the state of Colorado would establish criteria for understanding and limiting the amount of embodied carbon that could be used in the materials that go into those projects. And that applied specifically to cement, concrete, steel rebar, glass, and certain kinds of insulation. So we are very happy to be part of sponsoring that bill and testifying at the Senate, and look forward to more such collaborations with many of you in the next year or two. With that, I'm going to turn it over, I believe, to Kevin. Is that right?
Yep, you bet.
Okay, I will
Thanks,
stop
Paul.
there. And it was nice to get through that without any of those very strange and rude interruptions, wasn't it?
Great. You took the harder part of it, Paul. Thank you.
That
was good of you.
So, Kevin, before you start, we're trying to get two of our legislator guests back in the room. So trying to make sure we can get Representative Bird and Kraft Tharp back in. I've got the waiting room enabled, so I just have to wait for them to reattempt. And while we pause for a second, I really apologize to everyone. That is the first time all year that I've been involved in such an effort to crash a Zoom meeting.
It was everything they said it would be.
It was, and then some, yeah. I'm glad I didn't have too many screen captures from that.
This one's going to be fun to edit after the fact.
Yeah, good luck with that.
All right, Jerry said they were locked out, but I thought I was able to get them back in. So, all right, I am going to allow people to unmute themselves, and then I will quickly clamp down if any of those previous attendees are already are still in the room. All right, people can unmute now.
Great.
I will point out, I think, Kevin, you are duplicated on my screen, so it's possible that there could be another bug there.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm presenting on one device and advancing on another one, so that's legit.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate
Although
that.
this did happen to my kids at their first day of school, so now I feel very cool and hip, like I'm like them now, you know.
Great. Should we wait a minute, Nick, for Representative Bird?
I'd like to give them just another second to try to get back in, because I was able to let one individual into the waiting room, so that seems to be working on our end. So just waiting for them to try to give it another shot. I'm texting with Jerry to see where we are at.
So for time's sake, I would suggest, why don't you keep going?
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll go ahead and do that and get back to it.
Great. So hello, I'm Kevin Hieronymus. I'm a principal at Shears Atkins Rockmore Architects here in Denver, around the country, and around the metro area. A lot of our work tends to be along transit lines and in downtown cores, kind of reuse. Lucking, who's on the line from Fentress Architects, because I'm actually stunt doubling on her slides today. So the previous iterations of this presentation had a start with DIA, but we're going to start with something a little closer to home for this group, and piggyback a little bit on what Paul was talking about with some notions of both infrastructure and reuse and the carbon that goes into the built environment. So a lot of the work we all do is looking at new buildings and how they affect the built environment. But looking at reuse of existing infrastructure and facilities is also a really important tool towards reducing carbon infrastructure. So we're going to look at a site at Ralston and Garrison today, just flip through a few slides on this project and describe beyond the building aspect, what the community-wide aspect can do for not only carbon sequestration and reduction use in buildings, but also community connectivity and kind of health and well-being in that environment. So this is in Senate District, I think 27 for Brianna Titone, and that just to the west of all of the folks that are online right now. But this is a site that is primarily parking lots and big box retail right now. But it's also surrounded by a lot of potential in terms of connectivity, whether it's the bus lines you see in green, the bike infrastructure you see in black, or the light rail line to the south. And taking advantage of elements like that, or something that can improve a component called walk, get around without relying on single occupant use vehicles. And this is its current walk score for a site. And I think what we're hoping is that through the master planning efforts of this site, that score improves. So this is looking at a little more detail at a portion of this site. The community creek and the bike path are all to the north in the top right side of the screen. And it's really reconsidering what the potential is for that site and how the connectivity of that site goes together with really quite a lot of good surrounding infrastructure. So this is a place that has been sort of made for cars. And now this is kind of reconsidering how that can be made for more than just cars, that it can be made for more than just single family housing or big box retail, but looking at multifamily residential or townhomes as part of that. And really building on the sense of place that you have with a Central Park immediately. Goes through and looks at connectivity, some different strategies for walkability. If you can't have good sidewalks, of course, the connectivity from a park nearby, no matter how good it is, falls apart. So this is some of the early work on this project has actually been going for nearly 17 years now, since the first efforts to look at this project, go through, clean up the site. We did a really unique town hall meeting recently outdoors in a park to respect social distancing, where we had about 20 easels set up and a video that kind of gives the history of this site. So how does this relate to decarbonizing the built environment? Well, for one, I've mentioned, looks at measuring carbon in new infrastructure, and rather than building new infrastructure, this looks at relying on existing and potentially better utilizing that infrastructure for a more diverse variety of uses and occupants through there. One of the strategies on that is still but not making the cars so prominent. So what you see on the screen here is a strategy to engage the parking slightly into the grade, lift the residences, but then also create some stoops on the street side, which are in more dense urban environments, often a place where people congregate. So you see a little bit of envisioning of placemaking as part of this strategy. One of the comments that we hear often about sustainability is you can have the most sustainable, the most energy efficient building or community. But if it's not beautiful and people don't love it, then it's not really sustainable. It's doing a little bit better, but it's not making it a place that people love and care for and want to be in. So that gives you a quick idea of some of the ideas close to your community of reconsidering some old infrastructure. And I'll go now into a portion of the slides that our colleague Deborah put together to just discuss a little bit of the difference between embodied carbon and operational carbon. And in the current times right now, I expect my household is not the only one. These slides are we used to. And one of the ways we've often described this is the embodied carbon for that loaf of bread, beautiful loaf of bread, Deborah, in the oven there, is what it takes to grow, fertilize, harvest, process, package, deliver to the store, the bags of flour with which you make that bread. And you can consider the operational carbon, that component of what it is when you turn on your gas or electric oven in your home. and bake that bread. And that, of course, relates to the building. We'll turn to some slides for that in a moment. And why do we do all of this? Really, it's about a triple bottom line concept of planet, profit, and people. This isn't just about one aspect of sustainability or carbon reduction. It's looking at all the costs associated with the building. So the cost of getting that grain operates in a building, how much it costs to operate the building as it goes, and what's the long-term use of that building down the line. How does that affect people? That goes a little bit to the planning diagram that we looked at. Public health and productivity, connectivity to their neighbors, being able to walk, visit, learn who your neighbors are. Those are all important part of the social costs of a triple bottom line prospect. And then, of course, the ecology side of it, the environment, what's the ecological footprint of these buildings. And Brandon's going to go through a number of examples within the state of Colorado from our firms and others that address that a little bit more. So when we talk about the things that we measure, Paul gave a great example of what Cuningham Group is measuring. Our firm, Shirzak and Rockmore, just signed on to the 2030 commitment. And there's a component to that we don't yet know what we've gotten ourselves into, which I'm really excited about. We will go through and benchmark all of our projects that have been done to date. And in addition to that, that commitment is to benchmark all those projects going forward so that we have a sense transparency. So if we don't know yet how our buildings are doing, we have a pretty good sense, but if we don't know specifically how our buildings are doing, we can't really say how we think they are getting better with how we design them. So when we look at those things that we measure, yes, there's dollars behind this, and a lot of our previous presentations have discussed what is the contribution of the client, the developer, and a lot of our work in determining those decisions, because this room, this group of architects here is intensely involved in this, and we try to push our buildings to be as good as possible. If you have a developer who's only interested in measuring that first thing, say the cost, you're going to want to put in the cheapest thing fastest and turn around and sell it. So it's more than just architects wanting to do the things. It's also constituents, clients, developers wanting to do those things as well. And of course, looking at the entire cycle of what goes into a product, it's not just building a building, but it's what material is extracted to produce the materials that ultimately become part of your building. And how easy or difficult is it to get those materials to a site? How easy or difficult is it to get them out of the ground? And then to transfer them into something that we're using in the built environment. And this slide just gives you an idea of how much a typical high-rise building, how the energy use and the operational carbon are different. So the operational carbon is really only about that top quarter of it when you look at the entire life cycle. So a lot of the energy that's embodied and the carbon that's embodied in the building goes into that structural frame, be it concrete, steel. Brandon will show us some examples of a wood building type that's we're seeing more of, that's a little more mindful of this component of it. And then, of course, what happens at the end of life with these buildings, because if you're building something that can only be demolished by tearing it down, imploding it, whatever the case may be, considering what happens to those materials when you get to the end of a life cycle of a building is important as well. So we talked before about transparency. We're seeing more and more interest in what's in materials. So much like the nutritional labels that you would see in that bag of flour, you see now that architects have available to them or can insist from manufacturers that we know what is in the products that we're specifying to go into a built building environment. So on the product side of it, that might be, what are the emissions from that? Are there any chemicals that are hazardous to human health as part of the manufacture? Are there any animal testing in the testing of the material and the development of it? And then also the embodied carbon transparency of it. So we're seeing a shift in the industry as more and developers, clients are aware of this. It's a question that's being asked, so that transparency is leading to transformation. And we've looked in previous presentations just at what does that look like? What's the embodied carbon cost difference between concrete or steel? And if we look through the concrete, it's a very intensive process to create and pour and deliver concrete. From the mining to the firing really cement manufacturing, when you make the cement itself, the thing that holds everything together, mixing, delivering it to the site, how it's used in the site, and then what happens to it at the end of it. Concrete typically, well, it's a great long-lasting building in terms of the life cycle cost of the building. What happens to it at the end of it is a little more challenging because it's it reaches the end of its useful life, or the dismantling and reuse of it is so cost prohibitive that it can't really be effectively done. Steel can look a little better in some regards because at the end of its life, it may be able to be reused. But again, you do have extraction, you have the firing of ore, you have what goes together to put all of that to extrude the shapes. And then, of course, similar component of getting it to a site. And when Brandon talks about cross-laminated timber building, that's another example of structure consideration. So maybe it's working its way the other way of using materials a little bit more intelligently. So this takes a little closer look at what happens of it, how much of those can actually be reused again. Concrete can be recycled and crushed and reconstituted into more concrete. Lumber and timber, of course, have some possibility of being recycled. In a light stick framed building, that's less likely than it is like the ceiling above me here, where it's a heavy timber construction, and that material can be reused in larger chunks. And it's where steel really starts to look pretty good because it can be recycled again, and a lot of it can be saved from a waste stream going into a landfill. So as we look through some of those components, Paul mentioned a little bit about the living building, or the different metrics that we use, such as LEED. And we just wanted to highlight another metric that looks a little bit beyond LEED and addresses carbon in a more thoughtful way, and it goes beyond the energy. A lot of energy calculation and use and consideration gets pretty engineering. And one of the things that this group, the Living Future Institute, came up with about 15 years ago now is, what does it look like if we look beyond making buildings less bad? What does it look like if we really consider buildings as a regenerative component of their environments rather than an extractive component of their environments? So they set this very high bar of a certification method called the Living Building Challenge. And there are 20 imperatives, as they call them, that deal with everything from place, agriculture, habitat, of course, water, energy, and light. But it reaches a little bit farther, and it looks to, health, well-being, happiness, beauty. And that is where the science and the engineering part of it really starts to blend with the beauty and the aesthetic part of it that most architects aspire to. And what you see here grid to a full Living Building Challenge certification on the right-hand side, and some alternate certifications on the way. And I think Brandon will show a few of those when we close out. This isn't pie in the sky idea. These are real buildings. This really happens. They're in and around not just the world, but also in Colorado. And this was Deborah's slide. I couldn't take this one of the pandemic, and took great note of what a difference we saw in the night skies when we saw such radically reduced emissions. And it reminds us how much these things are all tied together. We're talking about buildings in a sort of insular fact, but they are tied to everything else: how we build them, how we design them, how we get the materials there, how we operate them, how we come in and out of them, how we maintain and use them, all have an impact on giving us back something beautiful that it took something pretty horrific to make us realize. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brandon for some happier, actually, here in Colorado.
All right. Well, I will be very brief, just so that we can allow for some time here at the end for questions. I'm Brandon Gossard. I'm an associate and project architect with Anderson House Architects. And I was charged to start curating different local examples here in Colorado that start to show kind of how we can start moving in this direction. So what I'll do is I will start sharing my screen and we'll dive into it. Now, you'll see that this is a lighthouse, and it's definitely not in Colorado. And this is really just the what lessons that we.
Brandon.
Yep.
Now it's
there
coming.
we go. That's
There you
better.
go.
Now you see a lighthouse. Clearly not in Colorado. What we're trying to do is really draw a point towards, building towards net zero carbon or net zero energy has a lot of challenges. The lighthouse right here that we're showing is in Wisconsin, and it was an example where there was a really high intensity light that was really hot at the top, and it drew a lot of energy. They trucked diesel to this island, and when the National Park Service was looking to make this more sustainable, they had to think, well, we obviously don't want to deal with the environmental concerns of the diesel component. We want to get rid of fossil fuels, and when we got rid of the high intensity light and went with more energy efficient fixtures, it reduced basically the environment of the building. And that really gets to this idea that equipment, energy use, envelope, and the environment are all interrelated, and that changes to one will impact another. So once that high temperature light was removed, suddenly they started getting condensation problems. And to address it, they had to basically look at photovoltaics was the answer in this particular instance, to really think of it as a net zero project. And it had to be net zero because that it was literally an island. And, as with any type of, large national park project or sustainability or national park project, they always have to ask the same kind of checklist of questions. Is photovoltaics right here? Is a ground source heat pump right for here? And not every technique or technology will be appropriate for every project, but it is important to consider every tool and also to understand what every piece of equipment means. If you buy it, as Kevin mentioned, with the triple bottom line, we need to understand the life cycle cost. We need to understand the initial cost and how all of that is woven into that life cycle of the building. So getting closer to home here in Colorado, the first one we want to look at is a good example of embodied carbon. This is the Silverton School. It's 110 years old. So it's a great example of 110 years of embodied carbon investment. And in this instance, there was an update to the building systems after the building's coal-fired heating system finally failed. And so in this instance, it was a combination of different types of funding that came together in kind of a barn-raising atmosphere to make this project happen. That included BEST grants, so building excellent schools together. It included historic preservation tax credits. And then it also included a smaller sliver of dedicated property tax increases that county opted to pursue. But what it allowed them to do is take a building that was built back in 1911 and make it LEED Gold certified, providing insulation, new technology for all of their classrooms, and then rehabilitating that exterior facade so that they have a building for the next 110 years. And really that embodied carbon investment, it was only just an extension of now the operational carbon because we were able to take advantage of that existing infrastructure. Now moving into our backyard, the Cesar Chavez building, this is in downtown Denver. This was an existing high rise. And so if you remember the chart that Kevin had where actually it was more than a third of the total embodied carbon was in the structure, this was a building where they kept working in it while they were reskinning it. So they were able to extensively retrofit the structure, reduce the amount of energy use by almost a third, And not only that, it served as an example to other projects that this is something that is not only possible and viable in an active building, but it's a good path forward. In fact, when the city of Denver was considering their new police station 6, they had a whole different site in mind, and they ended up moving it downtown to where they have the pre-arraignment detention facility to make reuse of that building and the embodied carbon that is in place there. So it's just an example where one example can catalyze and inform future projects. This is one that Kevin is going to be very familiar with. This is the DU Burwell Center for Career Achievement. I love this building because it is that mass timber construction. It really looks at, how can we look at, timber and wood as structure versus concrete and steel. The fact that it's 44% more energy efficient, the fact that it's LEED platinum. There's a lot about this building and the way that the wood is used as the primary structure that looks to start to tip the scales towards sequestering carbon versus just producing a little amount of it. And I think Kevin's comment on this, and he could certainly speak at much more greater length and detail, is that really it's using trees for what trees do best, and that's sequestering carbon and making our lives better. Still looking at Denver. In this instance, I'll keep it a little bit brief, but this is really looking at how we can create and integrate demonstrations in everything that we do. So in this instance, the idea of educational demonstrations of net zero energy, really trying to showcase wherever we do have a public space, different ways of managing our limited resources. Because one of the unique positions that the public sector is in is the cost benefit question, it takes place over a much longer period of time. A private developer might look at, the next 5 years, the next 10 years, but cities and states, they look at the next 50, the next 100 years. And ultimately those stakeholders and shareholders, they will keep reaping benefits either through just more programs, because the operational costs will come down, or the lower taxes, depending on how their community decides to prioritize things. And it really is the way that these programs can catalyze improvements. So right here we're talking about electrification, and so that is trying to position buildings to where they can take advantage of grid electricity, which as we shift more and more to renewables will become ever more and more green. And actually these three examples, the one on the right, you can see this is the one that Paul brought up with the Sierra Grande, a brand new building. He actually, the one on the left, it was originally constructed in 1930, the Fort Lupton School, and much earlier in kind of one of its iterations of expansion, Paul was actually able to work on this building. And with the BEST grants more recently, we were able to then update it and kind of push it that much further and really look at how can we remove fossil fuels from the operation of these buildings. And the two on the one on the left and the one in the middle rely on a ground source heat pump. And so that is something that can be run just on electricity. The one in the middle, the Custer County School, used photovoltaics so that it helps to offset basically their peak billing with the local electricity provider. So it dramatically reduced their total billing to be able to operate this school. And that's part of, when we find these tools, the ground source heat pumps, building integrated photovoltaics, it makes these type of design decisions not only possible, but very, very realistic, because these are all funded in more rural areas where every dollar counts, and they really have to be mindful about where those investments occur. And really, the project we'd like to end with is one on the opposite side of West Denver. This is actually in South Adams County, in Commerce City. And this was just an example where, you know, sometimes when you have that embodied carbon building, it's not going to work. You know, it's either there's going to be structural problems or system problems, and you will have to make that consideration of what do we do with this building. And in this instance, South Adams County needed a larger structure. This was built right next to their existing admin building while it was in operation. We used a very similar tool, the heat pump, but we actually didn't have the large upfront cost of a well field because the Water and Sanitation District had a water reservoir there where we could take advantage of the temperature of the return water that cycled on a regular basis to help condition the building. So we're taking advantage of existing infrastructure. We are taking advantage of kind of a very unique arrangement to be able to reduce that upfront cost. And, you know, in a building like this, where you're doing your high performance envelope, you're doing your daylighting, your low-E glazing, this building is twice as big, but it doesn't use even as much energy as the building it replaced. And so these are all the different, you know, moving parts that, you know, are examples of how we're trying to push just a little bit further and build that toolbox. Because each one will try and set that stage that we can, you know, decide to try and do one better. And with that, we can kind of, you know, go to closing thoughts for attendees and constituents. Sorry, we kind of got squeezed here at the end. And so really, with that, I mean, these are kind of the points that we were trying to convey, and really, you know, understanding is one of the critical components. Raising awareness is a big part of trying to make these things happen. And really, you know, this third point here, the transparency leads to transformation, is so absolutely critical. And architects are not the only entity pushing towards this. There are so many different participants, so many different stakeholders. And, you know, like every good project that we've looked at, it's a barn raising. It takes a community and it takes all of these different actors acting together. And, you know, I believe the comment was that you can't manage what you can't measure. And the idea being that the more information is out there, the more transparency that there is, the better we are able to make smart decisions.
Dan, way to get that presentation and link to that presentation, because I have some people that would want to share it with.
I think once Kevin or Nick can clean it up, we'd be glad to. And we do have previous versions of it that would be without the extra editing. So I know we do have a version of it from previous we can share.
Yeah, we do have, we did this with Fort Collins Legislators a week and a half ago, and that was just uploaded to YouTube. So a few differences in projects, but generally the same presentation.
And you can probably clean out some of that stuff, right? Because it was really just, I think the one slide of mine where we paused with all that nonsense.
There will be a little bit of a jump, but yeah, I will still have the recording of this and will edit it as much as I can.
Great. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat. I welcome back Representative Kraft-Tharp. I don't think we were able to get back Representative Byrd, but I do just want to say thank you so much. It was really interesting information, and I really like the way that you were able to kind of localize some of the information about projects that are in our area. You know, that project on the Ralston crossing right there on Ralston Road, I drive by that quite frequently. And so it's really good to know that those are some of the considerations that are going into planning some of our future spaces. I think that this is also a really interesting topic at the local level. And so I'm really interested in how we can kind of combine policymaking at the state level with policymaking at the local level. You know, Representative Byrd used to be on the Westminster City Council. I know that Representative Kraft-Tharp will soon be a county commissioner. And so I think that the integration of policy, you know, in this area is going to be very beneficial. There was a greenhouse gas emission roadmap that just came out not too long ago that really focused on a lot of these questions. And people tend to focus on, in particular, the transportation section, but not necessarily the other, you know, components of that plan. And you demonstrated that the largest component of that plan really is that built environment context. So it's good to know that there's some strategies there where we can still work on the decarbonization of our environment. So I would just want to say thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity today for this conversation. And I also appreciate the fact that you've put up your contact information there on the last screen. So if anybody has any questions or further comments, they can contact you directly. And thank you so much to Jerry Johnson for offering this program and getting this set up for us. And I just want to wish everybody a happy afternoon. Is there any of the other hosts today that would like to kind of wave us out?
I'll wave us out. Thank you all very much for joining us. And I think Lindsay's still here. Lindsay's waving.
Yes,
Hi,
I
Klaus. There she is.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time, everyone.
Take care, all.
Thank you all.